about for Isaac? Because his mother has died, right? Let's go to verse 25, verse 20. David, do you want to read that for us, sir?
25, verse 20.
Yes, 25, verse 20. Genesis 25, verse 20. And he might need a mic, Grandpa.
He was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife.
So we don't know when Abraham sent his servant, but it was probably close, probably within a year, right? So he was about 40 when he got married. So we have an idea. When they're calling Abraham old, he's probably around, how old? If he was 100 when Isaac was born? And Isaac is 40 now. How old's Abraham?
Close to 140.
Close to 140. So he's about 140 years old. Somewhere between 137 and 140. And this is probably very close to 140. So that was our history lesson at the beginning. The last part of the verse, we go all the way back to Genesis 24, verse 1. In what was Abraham blessed? What did it tell us?
All things.
In all things. Is Abraham unique in that?
We need to recognize that. We may not, but we should.
We absolutely should. How about, Grandpa, Romans 8:28? What's it tell us? Somebody probably knows it by memory. Yeah, say it again loud in the microphone, Grandma.
I'll let Grandpa read it.
And then we'll ask the question, why? Abraham was blessed in all that he did. Are we blessed?
And we know that in all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose.
So if we want to be blessed in all that we do, what must we do? There were two things in the verse. What did it say? What was the first one? How must we view God? It isn't what it said, Grandma, but you're correct.
Love God.
Love God, yes. Did Abraham love God?
Yes.
Absolutely. That enables God to bless him. And what was the second part, which is really important as well?
Called according to his purpose.
Called. Was Abraham called? He absolutely was called, wasn't he? What was he called to do?
To leave his home and go to the land that will become the promised land.
Absolutely. And did he act upon that call?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So if we want God to bless us, we don't need to just give him lip service, do we? We need to be willing to do what? Pick up stakes. Go ahead and say it, David.
And do what the Lord bids us to do.
Do what the Lord asks us to do. That's what enables God to bless us. So if we merge Genesis 24, verse 1 with Romans 8:28, we learn that if we want to be blessed like Abraham was blessed, we first need to love God, and then we need to be able to do something about it. We need to be willing to leave Ur of the Chaldees, take our whole family and probably flocks and herds. It wasn't just, load them in the back of the station wagon and go. It was a lot more complicated affair back in those days. And there weren't rest stops along the interstate to stop and have pizza along the way. It was a little bit different back then. We need to be willing to be called and to act according to God's purpose. All right, so that was a little tangent just from the Sabbath school, from the memory verse. Any comments, things that people wanted to cover on the bottom of, or in the rest of Sabbath's lesson? Just briefly an overview then, we're going to cover Isaac's near-death experience, his marriage, and Abraham's third marriage. So that's what we're going to cover today. But let's jump on to the top of Sunday's lesson. And we're going to need to go to Genesis 22. And I'll need some readers again. So Genesis 22, verse 1. And am I allowed to call on Nick or Heather? All right, maybe David, you can pass the mic back to them. Genesis 22, verse 1. We're looking for, backing up in time, what things have just recently happened. Now, we started with 24, verse 1, so that's Thursday's lesson. I don't know why they started with the memory verse from Thursday, but now we're backing up to Genesis 22.
Just verse 1?
Yes, sir.
And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am.
Abraham said, Behold, here I am. That was 22, verse 1, wasn't it?
Isn't that what you said, 22 verse 1?
Yes, exactly. So what does God say he's doing to Abraham?
Tempting him.
Tempting him, or another translation might be testing him. Any idea why? Someone willing to read Genesis 22, verse 12 for us? I'll jump ahead a little bit.
Then Abraham bowed himself down before the people of the land. Oh, excuse me.
22, verse 12, Grandpa.
And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything for him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.
So that's a spoiler alert. We're coming back to that one later. Why was God testing Abraham? What had he been waiting for 100 years? A son, yes. What do we know? 10 Commandments hadn't been given yet. Does God want anything to be put before him in our priorities? Nick?
The 10 Commandments hadn't been written down yet.
They existed, but they hadn't been put in stone yet. Well said. They've existed for all time, right? Because they're a transcript of God's character. Good point. What did God not want Abraham to do? Make his son an idol. Yes, that's where I was going, Grandma. He wanted to know that even after waiting 100 years, as important as this little baby boy, or maybe growing older young man, he wasn't a baby boy anymore, if his mother was soon to die, wasn't being put before God. Let's go to verse 2. Someone read for us Genesis 22, verse 2. What was he told to do? Norm's going to read for us.
I've got it. Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.
So did God know that he loved Isaac? Absolutely. It's right there in the text, right? But what's he told to do? Offer him as a burnt offering. Does that seem like a normal request? Is that something God would wake up some morning and give you as an instruction to do?
That was absolutely not a condoned operation.
Absolutely not a condoned operation. Leviticus 18, verse 21. George, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to say something about this Isaac, promised son, which Abraham waited so many years. Why God didn't ask him to offer as a child? Just, because we remember story about in Mesopotamia and other country, they offering child, God didn't ask him to do this. Why?
Why not sooner?
You know why? Because Abraham should taste a little bit, enjoy with his son. And he lived with him probably about 13 or 14 years. And if you raise that son and come together with him and enjoy every day, and God said to you, Abraham, bring me this son for offering. You know why? That's very difficult for Abraham.
I think there's even more to it than that, but maybe we come to it a little bit later. If it had happened when he was very young, when Isaac was very young, how much of an impression would it have made on Isaac?
Not too much.
Not too much. He might forget, right? But it does say he was strong enough to do what with the wood? We'll come to that a little bit further on. So as George said, is he a young boy? Is he 4 or 5 years old? He is not. He is strong enough to carry all the wood for the offering. Because Abraham told the other people to stay behind. So he's probably at least a teenager. But if you're a teenager and you go through an experience like this, how quickly do you think Isaac forgot this? It's probably for life, right?
How soon did you forget the snake bite in Africa?
Never forgotten. And I wasn't even 14. Sorry, Norm, did you have a hand? Yeah, someone passed Norm a mic.
Isn't Isaac like a pre-configuration of Christ where Abraham is like God, but he offered his son as a
Absolutely.
sacrifice?
And I think that's in Friday's lesson, so we will come back to it, Norm. You're spot on. Abraham's response, verse 3. Who's willing to pick up and read for us there? Please. Grandma, you reading for us?
And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, rose up, and went into the place of which God had told him.
So it was early in the morning. Tells you a little bit about Abraham, right? He doesn't sleep in until noon. He's probably a hard worker. He's probably a farmer. Cattleman, right? Stock manager. Notice something else. What does it say he did? Just a couple other little observations. Yes. How many 100-plus-year-old men or maybe 130-year-old men do you know that can go out and split the wood? I was looking at pictures that come up on we've got a photo frame at home that sits in the kitchen. And it flips up, 3,000 pictures of the family over the years, right? And there's one from a trailer in California splitting wood. And he was still splitting wood back then. There was a little young guy next to him that was carrying the light axe and was trying to split wood. So it still happens, but he wasn't 130 years old. Still not 130 years old. Working on it, though. Okay. Abraham's response. He's a very fit man at 130 years old or so. Verse 4. How long is the trip? 3 days. Someone want to read it for us? Please.
Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off.
Interesting that this wasn't a 2 or 3 hour trip. So what did the 3 days give for Abraham and for Isaac? What did it provide? George has got it. Say it again, George.
To deep think.
Yes. How difficult do you think those days were? What was Abraham thinking about? Was he thinking about the weather and the condition of the roads?
Yeah, I think Abraham just come to himself and said, if this voice is God's voice, and this goes with him probably that 3 days.
Every step for 3 days. You know what he was thinking about.
Every step that was probably close to 50 miles.
Yes, if he was down in Hebron, which is south of Jerusalem, to, maybe it's farther than that. I don't remember where he was. But Hebron to Jerusalem was like 35 miles. So, yes, Jerusalem. And that's about 35 miles away, something like that, I think. It's either 35 or 70, I can't remember.
But another thing, what's about Sarah? Abraham thought probably that I didn't tell my wife even.
Do we know if he told his wife?
We didn't know, but
don't know.
I think he didn't tell anything, because if yes, there will be problem.
Nick?
So maybe the 3 days is also another parallel with God the Father, that God the Father went through a tough experience for 3 days with his son over Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of
exactly.
Jesus' death, and resting in the grave and resurrection, etc. And so maybe that's another parallel as well.
I was going to go there, but I hadn't got there yet, Nick. You're right. Thursday night, Gethsemane. Friday morning, all day Friday, all day Sabbath in the tomb, rising Sunday morning. Where's 3 more days? Similar. Yes, Grandma?
I don't think that it was unusual for Abraham to go and sacrifice, so that's maybe why Sarah may not have suspected anything.
We're kind of inferring, though, so I've got to be careful about that. Usually, if it's in the Bible, we're comfortable with it, right? We can stand on its solid rock. If we are guessing, it's maybe true, Grandma, but I can't confirm one way or the other. I don't have a text to back that one up.
Well, we do know he had a household of about 1,000 people, and he usually brought them for morning and evening sacrifice.
Absolutely. Yep. Verse 5. Dr. Chapman, are you willing to read for us? May I call on you, sir, or you prefer I did not? I can fix that. Genesis 22, verse 5, sir, if you're willing. If not, my mom will take over. Yes, sir, please. There's a very important statement in Genesis 22, verse 5, which tells us a little bit about Abraham.
Here's your mic.
24, 21, 22, and verse 5. Genesis 22, verse 5.
Yes.
And Abraham said unto his young man, Abide me here with the ass, and the ass and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you.
What did you catch in that statement?
Well, I'm sorry. Either he was trying to keep his son comforted, or he had belief that he would be coming back.
I choose to believe the second interpretation. There's a statement of faith, is there not? Abraham was a man of what? Faith. Man of faith. What is he expressing in his statement to the young men? I and the young men are going to come back to you. He has belief that God will keep his promise. Verse 6. What can we learn from verse 6? Who wants to read that for us? Thanks, Nick.
And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together.
So we kind of caught on this earlier. What does this tell us about Isaac? He's a strong young man, right? If his father's at 130 can still split the wood, Isaac is strong enough to carry the wood in this case. So this is not a little toddler. This is not a baby on an altar.
Yes,
sir.
I have a question on the previous comment you made about a man of faith. Why would he take the knife and all the equipment ready to kill his son? In fact, he even had the knife raised to do it. And when you're a man of faith, do you go, well, I'll just leave the knife here?
Well, wait a second, though. What was the analogy? I think maybe Nick alluded to it earlier. Why has God given Abraham this test? So that Abraham could experience what? Could Isaac have been killed and raised again to life?
Well, the theologians teach that the whole scenario was demonstrating the sacrifice that God was willing to make with his only son. And he did start out by calling Isaac Abraham's only son, and Abraham had an equal investment in Ishmael. An equal investment in Ishmael. So that's all I got to say.
Could God have allowed Abraham to kill Isaac? And would that have been a problem? He could have raised him back to life, couldn't he? Either way, Abraham had faith he was coming back with this son because he knew this son was the son of the promise, right?
Well, let me ask this. How many times has a resurrection happened at this point in time? How many times had any Old Testament patriarch even observed or heard about a resurrection of the dead?
None that I know of. I don't know.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, you said, would it be a problem? It wouldn't have been a problem from a term of God's power or ability to do it. Could it have been a problem from God asking someone to kill their own son as a precedent?
There you go.
That could have been a problem, which is why I think why God obviously stopped Abraham. So maybe is the answer, I think, to your question, depending on the circumstances.
George.
You know how easy it will be to Abraham if he knows John 3:16. Yeah? Very
But it hadn't
easy.
been written yet. much later. All right, so we've got Isaac carrying the wood and Abraham bringing the fire. Now we come to a very tough question. Verse 7. Who wants to pick up reading there for us? 22, verse 7. And think of you as a father when your son asks you this question.
But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." Then he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?"
Young man's sharp, isn't he? Something doesn't compute here. What you going to say as a father? Jehovah Jireh. Ah, very good, Grandma. I didn't know what that meant. Thank you.
I think that this is a very difficult question for both of them. Because for Abraham, he still thinking about what he will be doing, you know. But Isaac, through 3 days, he think about, okay, I'm going, but where's the
lamb?
Lamb. You know, two together go with the same purpose, and they think about themselves.
But careful on this one. The fact that Isaac asked the question, what does it tell you? Did he know he was going to be sacrificed until this point?
No.
I think at this point, something started to compute. So Abraham has been agonizing for 3 days. Now I think Isaac is starting to think, What do you think, Nick?
Well, maybe a little offshoot to say, you know, if you think about, obviously, not necessarily what Abraham and Isaac were thinking about or their response to the scenario, but just to ask the question, would it have been fair, if we can use fairness in that context, would it have been fair for Isaac to have died in this scenario? Because if we think of this in terms of salvation and sin, right? The Bible says all have fallen short, all have sinned, and what is the wages of sin? Death.
Yep.
So did Isaac deserve to die? And the answer is yes, because we
Same
all
as all the rest of us.
deserve to die. And so it wasn't unfair for God to ask for this. And so the point, I think, is for us to realize in the plan of salvation that we're actually receiving something we don't deserve. That's the whole point of grace, is that we should deserve to die for our sins, but God makes a way for us not to have to do that, and his own son dies so that we can have that way. And so I think we want to not miss, it's not that Isaac dying is such a terrible thing. I mean, it is from a human standpoint, right? Killing anybody is not a good thing. God himself says that. But it is fair. I just wanted to add that.
Grandma.
I think it's good that he did not allow Isaac to die, because the other nations were offering their children. And the other nations would say, well, see, our God's no different than your God.
Yep. I didn't have you read that, but there was Leviticus 18:21 and then Genesis 21:12. 18:21 specifically says you're not supposed to sacrifice your children. So God tries to be consistent, right? Same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He would try to be consistent. But yes, it would be the unfair part is that we get to live, right? If we accept his sacrifice. That's the unfair part. Abraham's answer, a very prophetic answer, verse 8. Oh, Grandpa.
We need to see that consciousness came to Isaac that he was going to die. There was a time in the life of Christ where that consciousness also dawned on him. He did, as an infant, he didn't know that. He was human just like us. But as he talked with the Father, as he had personal, he came to realize that he was that lamb and he was going to die.
I don't know if it's Ellen White or where it was, but I think that's associated with his trip to the temple when he was 12, isn't it?
Yes.
For the seeing the sacrificial lamb for the first time. Abraham's answer, verse 8. Who can pick up and read for us there? What's significant about it, and what's some of the deeper meanings in his answer? Ms. Lane, you want to read for us?
Yeah.
And
Verse
Abraham
8.
said,
One moment, George. Mrs. Lane was going to read for us. Sorry, sir.
And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering." So the two of them went together.
So, what was prophetic about? I'm sorry, Nick.
What's more interesting if you cut the sentence off in half,
Okay.
and if you just read
Help us out.
if you just read the first 4 words of the answer, God will provide himself.
Ah, yes. The author points that out, doesn't he? There's two very good meanings to that explanation. Elaborate maybe a little bit more.
Well, I mean, obviously we know the end of the story. But God did provide himself, right? One member of the Godhood came down and provided himself as the lamb of sacrifice. And so this is the prophecy that says, you know, your own son doesn't have to die, but mine will.
Yep, absolutely. The bigger picture question, who's going to ultimately die for sin? God himself. Grandpa.
In the verse, in the New King James, it says, God will provide for himself the lamb. But that word for is not in the original.
Good point. Excellent. So there's both the temporal interpretation, the literal lamb that we provided for Abraham, but that's not the big picture. The big picture is God himself will provide a sacrifice for sin.
Well, there was a point, too, I think, in the lesson that talked about, you know, in English, we don't use much or don't study much about reflexive verbs, which is you typically doing something to yourself. So, like, if you take a shower, you're showering yourself, right? It's something you do sort of, it's the reflexive verb, and that's what it points out. This is a reflexive verb, so it's talking about God providing himself.
As a sacrifice.
As a sacrifice. It's not just God will provide something external, God will provide himself.
Mr. Lane.
Just another concern I assume that Abraham had was when he'd have to go back home. If he sacrificed his only son, and then he'd have to explain that to his wife, oh my, that's going to be tremendous pressure upon him.
Would have been a tough day in the Abraham household, wouldn't it? Other comments on verse 8? All right, let's move on to verse 9 then.
David, it's not directly on verse 8, but I think it would be helpful or interesting to think of, too. I think in all of our lives, there's lots of times when we don't understand the path through. And yet Abraham knew that he had been promised that he would be the father of a great nation.
Yep.
And that Isaac was the son of promise. And so whether Isaac was going to be resurrected or whatever God needed to do to make that promise happen, I think Abraham had faith that God would make it happen, even if he didn't understand how. And how is that any different than us? We may think, well, how does this work? And what is God going to do here? And what's going to happen? But we know we have prophecies that say how things are going to go. We know them to be true. We just may not know the how. And so should we have the same faith that it may seem weird, it may not be along with what we would expect, but if we trust God, we can know that he has the power to make it the way he promised.
If we can understand how it's going to be fulfilled, is it really faith then? Or is faith really called for when we don't see how?
I was thinking of that when we talked about the tempting or testing. If you take high school math students and you ask them 2 + 2, is that a real test? A test is only a test if it's hard, if it's difficult, if it's not easy to pass.
If you don't have to see how to get from here to there, if you don't know how you and your son are going to come back, that's when it takes faith. George, it looks like you're thinking something.
I think God didn't check Abraham because God didn't know about Abraham, But this is good for Abraham to understand plan of salvation. God provides for himself. This is very important. God never give us some kind of prosecution that he didn't know what we will do. This is good for us to come to mind and check ourselves if we are correct with him. And Abraham didn't know the purpose of this, but on his faith, he already said something which probably not come from himself.
No, from Holy Spirit.
This is from Holy Spirit, yeah. God provide.
Absolutely. I was going to come back to it later, but let's do it right now since George brought it up. Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Why are we sometimes tested? Who's willing to read that for us? Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Mr. Chapman, looks like you're digging deep in the word there, sir. Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Yes, sir. Why are we sometimes tested? Building on what George was saying. Grandpa's handing you a mic, Mr. Chapman, Dr. Chapman. Oh, sorry. You got it, Tom? Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Tom will help you out, George. Thank you, Tom.
And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not.
What is God trying to prove? What's in our hearts, right? Not because, as George said, not because God doesn't know, because God knows everything, right? When Job was tested, does anyone remember that? Was that because God didn't know what Job was going to do? Who was he demonstrating it to? The whole universe, right? The devil amongst others, but really to the whole universe, right? There's at the end of time, as much as we may think the judgment is about what each of us has done, who is really on trial in the scope of these 6,000 or 7,000 years? Whose character is really on trial? God's character, right?
And David, it points out, I think, the fact that I think a lot of people would say, I have faith. But I think it implies that faith, because only God can know what's is in our hearts, but so that everyone can know, faith is an outward action.
Yep.
Right? So will you keep the commandments? Will you follow God? When the test comes, will you pass the test? Those are outward actions that others can see. Because no one else can know what's in your heart, but the actions can show where your heart really is.
Let's go to Hebrews 11, verse 1. Building on Nick's thought. Who can read that for us? And then we'll go to James afterwards.
I've got it.
Hebrews 11, verse 1.
Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen.
So it's not the seeing that demonstrates our faith, is it? It's the unseen, right? Let's jump to James 2, verses 17 and 19. Who can read that for us? Harold or Mercy, way back in the back. Would one of you be willing to read for us? You guys look so quiet and so far away. I want to include you. James 2, 17 and 19. If you would, Ms. Mercy. We're looking for faith. What does faith require? Building on what Nick was saying.
Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe that there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble.
So just faith up here, or faith that translates into actions? James is telling us it's about the actions, isn't it? And Abraham was demonstrating with action that he has faith, that he believes. We don't want to be the devil's trembling. They believe, but they're taking the other kind of actions. All right, way back to Genesis 22 again. I think we left off somewhere around verse 10. Oh, we skipped 9? All right. Preparations for the sacrifice. Someone want to read verse 9 for us? Grandpa?
Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the wood on order. And he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood.
A little bit of detail maybe you don't want to know. Has anyone ever seen an animal be slain? I have unfortunately had the privilege. We had a neighbor when I was growing up in Africa that had a goat for Sabbath lunch, I think it was. And I heard something making noise in the backyard and went over and looked over the fence. And I saw the experience. They also sometimes had chicken. And I don't know, have you heard the expression of what happens to a chicken when you're killing it? Does it die immediately? Yes, you've heard the analogy. What is Abraham having to do? What did it say? Little details matter in the Bible. Why? What did he know was going to happen? Yes, his son is going to have to be up on the altar. Is he taking it serious? Yes, and another important, I'll come back to 1 second, George. What does this also tell you about Isaac? He is a young, strong man, right? He is allowing it to proceed.
But look at that. God called twice. If God called twice, Abraham, Abraham, why he did this? Because Abraham really,
Yep, he was going to do it.
only a distance that he was going to kill.
It also tells you something about Abraham as a parent, because obviously Isaac was used to submitting to his father's authority. He trusted his father. He had been trained to trust God, right? So it wasn't just, oh, you know, hey, I'm Eli, and I just let my sons run around and do whatever they want, and then when God calls, they don't know anything. Isaac had obviously been raised, I guess I would say, correctly.
With
right?
a very strong bond of trust, right?
Yes.
Your father wakes up in the morning and says, son, it's time for you to die today. How many sons are going to say, sure, Dad, we're going to go ahead with that plan? That sounds like a good one. There's a very strong father-son bond, isn't there? And out of this relationship, what came up? What do you think happened to that bond? When we go through trials and tribulations, what happens to bonds in marriages? When you go through tough times in marriages, if you come out of the other side, what happens to that relationship? Does it get weaker or stronger?
Stronger.
Absolutely stronger. God is setting a good precedent for the whole Israelite lineage, is he not? Of a strong family relationship, a strong relationship built on faith in God. And it transfers from father to son. Gives Isaac a very strong memory that will last him through his whole life, right? Based on this situation. We still have time. Okay, we probably won't read most of the rest of the story, 10, 11, 12. Let's read 13 through 18, though, please. Jumping ahead, and then I think we'll be mostly done with Sunday's lesson, which took a very long time. 13 through 18. 22 verses 13 through 18. Who can read for us for a bit? We're looking for why God did this again.
I'll read it quickly. And
Thanks,
Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, I don't know how to pronounce that, Jireh, that's it, Jehovah Jireh, there you go.
Said, yep.
As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time, and said, By myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice.
So we spent a lot of time talking for the last 20 minutes or so about the importance of this experience for Abraham and for his son. But in the last part of what Nick read, who was the real beneficiary of this experience?
All of us.
Both of them.
All nations. And that's why it's in the Bible and we're still reading about it today. Another little detail. Anybody know what happens to moose and elk sometimes when they get in fights in rutting seasons? Yes. What happens to the two animals usually when something bad like that happens? Anyone know? Yes. What happened to this ram? Just a little side note. The Bible has so many little, if you think about it, you look into the details in the Bible, there's almost always, it's like an onion, right? You can peel it. What was going to happen to this ram? He was probably going to die. His horns were caught in a thicket. So even when God has a purpose for the lamb, maybe you could say I'm getting too far off on a tangent here, but there's mercy in what he actually does.
I don't know if it's a stretch. Maybe it is, so I'll start that at the beginning. But to say, what can you imagine, or if you think of a thicket, what's in a thicket?
Thorns.
And how was it caught? By its tail, by its legs, or whatever, caught by its head, right? So now you've got another sort of allusion to Christ with the crown of thorns.
Oh, I didn't think about
caught
that.
on its head, right, etc. And so, I mean, again, maybe that's a stretch, but
all kinds of details in the Bible,
it's an interesting detail.
Anything else that people picked up from Sunday, and maybe it was even, mostly of Sunday's lesson, Genesis 22?
There's an important lesson there, I think, that the obedient are the ones who bless the nations.
Yes.
Not the rebellious, not the others. It's those who obey to the extreme, obey.
That God's able to use to be a blessing. Absolutely. Okay, Monday's lesson.
Sorry, hey, maybe we mentioned this, but before I move on, why can God bless and multiply Abraham? It says it right there. Why? It says because he was obedient. So if we expect to be blessed, if we expect to receive the blessings in the Bible, all the different things that God has promised, I mean, there's tons of blessings in the Bible. Can we expect to receive those if we are knowingly and willfully disobeying God's commands? I think a lot of the Christian world thinks the answer is yes. I think a lot of the Christian world thinks I can do whatever I want, and yet I can still go pray to God, ask God for things, expect God to bless me, and yet I'm disobedient. And
that's not what the text said, is it?
This does not imply that by any means.
It implies exactly the opposite. If we want to be blessed, and I think we touched on that at the very beginning, what enables God to bless us, it was in Romans 8:28, I think it was. What enables us to be blessed is our willingness to act on faith, to obey. Monday's lesson. Let's see. Let's jump to Romans 5, verses 6 through 8. Did we read that already?
I'm going to bring out one thing more on Sunday.
Grandpa.
In the last days, God's true church in the last days, we are told that many within the church will go out. But they were also told that there are many that are outside the church will come in. And God is going to have a large number, a great multitude, that are obedient and faithful to Him. We need to find out which of those two groups we are in.
It will be demonstrated by our actions, not just by our thoughts, won't it? Romans 5, verses 6 through 8. What is unusual about when and for whom Christ died? Ms. Brazel, are you willing to read for us? I couldn't hear. Was that a yes or an old? I'm getting old, Ms. Shirley. Norm will bring you a microphone. 5 verses 6 through 8, Ms. Shirley. What is unusual about when and for whom Christ died?
For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us.
So who did Christ die for? Ungodly, including me, all of us, right? even while we were still sinners. There's a quote from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 154. Is someone willing to read that for us in Monday's lesson? Why are we, the question we're looking for is, why are we told Abraham was put through this ordeal? Someone willing to read that from Monday's lesson? Patriarchs and Prophets 154? Starts with, it was to.
It was to impress Abraham's mind with the reality of the gospel, as well as to test his faith, that God commanded him to slay his son. The agony which he endured during the dark days of that fearful trial was permitted that he might understand from his own experience something of the greatness of the sacrifice made by the infinite God for man's redemption.
Does God like to have us understand him at least a little bit? What do you think? We were created to love him, were we not? We were created to grow and to thrive under his tutelage. Does he like to be understood sometimes? Do we as humans like to be understood? Maybe God likes to be understood a little bit too.
Jesus said to his disciples, "Many things I have to say unto you, but you can't understand them yet."
They weren't able to handle it, were they? Nick?
Well, John 8:56 says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." And, I think that's the answer to how did Abraham see Jesus' day, and this is how he saw it. He didn't have the New Testament. He didn't have a lot of the rest of the Bible that we have, and yet he was able to see the plan of salvation and the sacrifice that was going to be made for the whole world and how the whole world was going to be blessed in this experience. So, Jesus, these are the words of Jesus that I read, they tie together.
And you can tie it a little bit to Moses. I didn't look up the text for this one, but remember there was a time when God told Moses, just let me go wipe out those people, I'll make you a new nation. But what did Moses say? Nope. Take me, yep. Grandpa. Oh, you're good? Okay. George?
The best understanding, like here says, by own experience. This is for Abraham. The best lesson.
Yep.
And he understood, that lesson very well.
And I think Isaac did too.
Oh, yeah.
In the last days, the Spirit of prophecy says, we have great lessons to learn. And if we don't learn them early, we will learn them late, but it'll be with extreme difficulty.
Under duress. Yep. When the pressure's on. Let's see. Luke 9:23. Does God want us to understand or share in his experiences? Luke 9:23. Who can read that for us? Ms. Rula, your side has been really quiet today. Are you willing to read for us? All right. Norm, would you be willing to pass the mic to her? Luke 9:23. Does God want us to share his experiences with him? We shared our opinions on it. What does the Bible actually say?
Then he said to them all, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me."
What does God want us to do?
Follow him.
Carry these light little burdens that shortages and, I don't know, can't find the right cheese I want this week or something.
He does say that later. He says, "My yoke is easy."
Yes, he does. But that cross was a heavy cross, wasn't it? So heavy that Christ couldn't even carry it himself. He was too beaten down that day. Through all he'd been through. So God does want us to experience what he experiences, does he not? Let's have a look at Galatians 6:2. What again are we instructed to do? What's it say there? Who else is willing to read for us? Do I need to find a quiet person? David, would you be willing to read for us, sir? Galatians 6:2. When you're ready, sir.
Okay. Galatians 6:2.
Yes.
Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ.
What are we told to do?
Bear one another's burdens.
Not just carry Christ, the cross that Christ carried, but care for each other, right? Why? Why did it say? This does what? What was the last part of it?
To fulfill the law.
Ah. What is the law of God about? Grandma's going to where I was going. Usually we think about the Ten Commandments, right? All the do's and the don'ts. But what is this talking about? What was there and what has always been there behind the 1, the 2, and the 10? Yes, the 1 is love, right? Love for who? God and, what did it say here? Fellow man. And that's what all the Ten Commandments are about. Grandpa.
A cross and a yoke are both made out of wood, but there's a big difference. The yoke is two people together, but the cross, Christ did it all alone.
Yep. Well said, Grandpa. Last one from Monday's lesson, John 13:34. What must we do? Who's willing to read that one for us? John 13:34. Thanks, Ms. Rula. We need to get you a mic. Who's got I think David has it, Norm. Thank you, sir. What must we do? John 13:34.
A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another.
What must we do?
Love.
Love one another, which means being willing to carry the yoke, being willing to carry the cross, being willing to climb up on that altar and be bound if that's what we are asked to do. That's what the Lord expects us to do. Anything else from Monday's lesson that people wanted to pull out? All right, zipping right along to Tuesday's lesson. Genesis 22, verse 23. We are switching gears now. This is further forward. We don't know how many years. Around the time of the death of Sarah or shortly after the death of Sarah. So Isaac is now over 37 and probably getting very close to 40. Genesis 22, verse 23. What happens there? Who can read for us? Norm.
22, verse 23.
Yes, sir.
And Bethuel begot Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother.
Now, just a technicality there. Far be it from me to quibble with the Bible, but who begat Rebekah? What is anatomically incorrect about this statement? Bethuel's wife had Rebekah. But anyways, yes, she is the daughter of Bethuel. Many times we're told the mothers that actually had the daughters, but this one we're not told. So we don't actually know Bethuel's wife's name. We're not told. Genesis 23, verse 1. What do we call it? What's our attention called to? Sarah's death. At age? We talked about it at the very beginning. 127. So how old is Isaac? 37 years old. Jumping forward to verse 5. What can we learn about how Abraham is viewed by the residents of Canaan? The author calls our attention to this. Yes. Read it for us, though, please, if you would, Nick.
Verse 5, And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us. In the choice of our sepulchres bury the dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead.
So how is he viewed? Great respect. He has established a reputation in those years he's wandered in Canaan, and it's a very positive one. Verse 9, what does he desire to purchase? Yes, Miss Shirley has it. Which cave? Does anyone remember? What's it called?
Machpelah.
Oh.
Machpelah, yes.
Oh.
Anyone know where it is? Anyone Google it?
Hebron, isn't it?
Yes, a little bit south. It's actually called the Al-Ibrahim Mosque. And you can Google it and you can see it. It's about 30 miles south of Jerusalem. Still there to this day. And people say they don't believe Genesis. Verse 16. It's amazing, isn't it? If we choose to be willfully ignorant, the Lord is going to give us that freedom, is he not? Verse 16. What price does he pay?
400 shekels.
400 shekels of silver. What do you think is unusual about that? Look up Genesis 37, verse 28. Who can read that for us? Some of us are involved in economics. We'll also read Matthew 25, 26, verse 15. Sorry.
Then there passed by the Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt.
So how much was Joseph worth? 20. How much was his property worth? So equating it?
How much was Jesus for?
Exactly. Matthew 26, verse 15. Who's going to read that for us?
30 pieces of silver.
30 pieces of silver. So what happened, for those of you who are doing, the price of a slave is what? 1/20th of the price of the land, if I did my math correctly. He bought the land for the price of 20 slaves, approximately. And at the time of Jesus, what had happened to the price of a slave?
Not gone up very much.
Well, it had gone up a bit. 30 versus
20.
50% increase in how many years? Over 800 years, isn't it? Not much inflation back then, is there? If you were in the banking business, Nick, you wouldn't have made much money, would you, off of that?
Apparently not.
In 800 years, you're making 50% interest. That's not a lot. I think we expect it to double, what, about every, is it 3 or 4 years if you're aggressive in your investment?
Every 7 years.
7 years? Okay, a little more conservative. Grandpa.
Comparing this with what was given for Rebekah in chapter 24, this is equivalent to 800 gold rings.
800 gold rings for the property?
Yeah, 800 gold rings.
It was valuable land then, wasn't it? And I know that we don't have time to go through it here, but you notice the discussion that took place between Abraham and the people he was negotiating with.
They kept saying, we'll give it to you, and he says, no, I'll pay. And they said,
yes,
no, we'll give it
isn't
to
it
you.
very
No, I'll
cordial?
pay. It's like guys wrestling over the check at a restaurant.
Yes, who's going to do the good deed for somebody else? Do you see some contrast to some of the discussions we see today in politics and elsewhere? George.
The question is, Abraham lived there among that people, and he has a good opinion. They treat him very well, and they wants to give him for free. Question is, why Abraham anyway wants to pay, and after that he paid? Why?
Because he wants to keep the good relationship, no?
But this was promised land from God. This was promised land when he lived that time.
Yep.
Why he especially anxious to never accept the favor, but he wants to pay? Why?
I don't know. What do you think?
So many heads, please.
Well, it also reminiscent of when he went and rescued Lot, and they said, "Oh,
not even a shoelace, right?"
Take all the spoils, and he said, "No, I'm not going to keep anything." So he seemed very honorable.
Lend to many and be debtor to none. That's in the Bible too, somewhere, isn't it?
You know.
I don't know, George. You have to help us, man. I don't know.
I make some kind of research, and in that place has been buried Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and some scholars, they say this was the place which Adam was buried.
I don't know if we have proof for that one, though. Yes.
We never have, but we have proof for
all
of
the rest,
them
yes.
has been buried. Yeah.
It seems to me that the situation there today is a little different than the situation with Abraham.
Yes.
He was very generous in giving, but I don't see that generosity today.
All the goodwill has been extracted from the relationship, and there's nothing left but acrimony and hostility. All right, we are at 30, and we are on Tuesday's lesson. Wednesday's lesson, I have another lengthy passage to go through, and there's a lot of points we could pull out from the experience with Abraham's servant Eliezer. But we don't have much time. So let's hit, how about just verse 12? We're going to have like 3 verses. We'll do the Reader's Digest version. What type of man is Eliezer? Genesis 24, verse 12. Someone willing to read that for us?
Then
Yes.
he said, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please give me success this day and show me kindness to my master.
So what type of man is Eliezer? He's prayerful. He's praying just like his master does. What kind of a witness does that say Abraham has been? Powerful witness, right? Even his servants. I'm sorry, I don't remember the nationality of Eliezer, but I think he may have been in Syrian. Damascus, yes, it said he came from Damascus. That's what I was looking for. Going forward a bit, let's talk about this lady that he meets. What test does he propose to God? Verses 13 and 14. Someone willing to read for us? Yes, please. Yes, George, you want to pass the mic over? What test does he propose to God?
Behold, I stand here by the well of the water, and the daughters of the men of the city come out to draw water. And let it come to pass that the damsel to whom I shall say, let down thy pitcher, I pray thee that I may drink, and she shall say, drink, and I will give thy camels drink also. Let the same be she that thou hast appointed for thy servant Isaac, and thereby shall I know that thou hast showed kindness unto my master.
Anyone remember how many camels he had? 40, I think. It's in verse 10, and it is 10. 40 would have been even more, but still, 10 camels. Anyone know how much water camels can drink?
I'm sure a lot. Depends on how thirsty they are.
I looked it up. 200 liters apiece, 53 gallons in 3 minutes. He has 10 camels. How many gallons of water is she pulling out of the well?
A lot.
530 gallons of water. Each gallon weighs at least 6 pounds per gallon, and the wells are probably 30 or 40 feet deep. This is the way an engineer thinks, sorry. What kind of lady does that tell you this young lady is?
Bodybuilder.
She is a hard, dedicated worker, isn't she? What does it also tell her about her commitment to hospitality? In the Arabic countries, you still see this today. If somebody's walking by, can you even deny your enemy a glass of water? No. You wouldn't even deny your enemy a glass of water. It's in a desert country, water it's more valuable than gold. She recognizes that value, and she's willing to go not just the extra mile, but the extra 530 gallons or more. Let's see. What does he recognize in her response? Verses 26 and 27. We're probably not going to have time to read it. But what does he see in what she does? Who's actually answering his prayer? God has answered his prayer, hasn't he? And then you notice it actually says that she actually runs back to the house. So after lifting 530 gallons of water from the base of the well, she runs back to the house. So she's probably also pretty physically fit. Little details that the Bible gives us. What does he give her? Does anyone know? I won't have you read the verses. They're all there.
A nose ring and some...
A ring and some bracelets. Do you notice who notices the rings and the bracelets? Yes, in verses 50 and 51. Who is this gentleman? What's his name?
Laban.
Laban. What do we know about this guy's character? Many years later.
A little shady.
Has he changed? He notices the gold, and he comes running out to meet the merchant because of the bracelets and the nose ring. The Bible has details in here that if we are paying attention, we can catch. This guy's character, 40 years later, has not changed. He's still very much interested in the gold. And then you notice the conversations. Who, usually if you're discussing marriage, who do you go talk to? I went and asked permission. Who did I ask?
Father.
I went and talked to the father before I married my wife. And what do you think the father said? He said, yes, I'm married still happily many years later. In this case, did you notice who actually is the conversation with? Both Bethuel and Laban are there, and who ends up doing the talking? Laban ends up doing the talking. And do you notice who the gifts are given to? In verse 53 and 55. Who does it mention? And his mother. There's no Bethuel there, is there? So what does that tell you about the family dynamics in Bethuel's household? Matriarch is there, but also Laban. This son has basically exerted, or his father has let him exert the strength in the household. So there's some family dynamics here that are kind of interesting. And finally, in verses 57 and 58, who do they finally talk to about this really important question?
They asked Rebecca.
Yeah, they finally asked Rebecca, is she willing to go? Now, after you've talked to Bethuel, after you talk to the brother who likes the gold and says, yep, send her right away, they finally talk to her. And she does the right thing. She says yes. So there's some interesting dynamics we had to gloss over in Wednesday's lesson. I'd like to finish it up with the two Ellen White quotes on the last page. Let's see. Maybe we'll read at least one of those. I think Nick was alluding to this on Friday's lesson. The first quote from Testimonies of the Church starts with Isaac was. Who can read that for us? Please. Oh boy. Somebody.
Isaac was a figure of the Son of God, who was offered a sacrifice for the sins of the world. God would impress upon Abraham the gospel of salvation to man. In order to do this and make the truth a reality to him, as well as to test his faith, he required him to slay his darling Isaac. All the sorrow and agony that Abraham endured through that dark and fearful trial were for the purpose of deeply impressing upon his understanding the plan of redemption for fallen man. He was made to understand in his own experience how unutterable was the self-denial of the infinite God in giving his Son to die to rescue man from utter ruin. To Abraham, no mental torture could be equal to that which he endured in obeying the divine command to sacrifice his Son.
So one very important message. God wants us to understand how important was his sacrifice. The second message, and the second Ellen White quote. Someone willing to read that for us? Something else that's very important for us to get out of this lesson. Abraham had to become an old man. Someone willing to read that? Please.
Abraham had become an old man and expected soon to die. Yet one act remained for him to do in securing the fulfillment of the promise to his posterity. Isaac was the one divinely appointed to succeed him as the keeper of the law of God and the father of the chosen people, but he was yet unmarried. The inhabitants of Canaan were given to idolatry, and God had forbidden intermarriage between his people and them, knowing that such marriages would lead to apostasy.
Does marriage matter?
Yes.
Interesting thing. How old was Isaac at this point? Remember where we started the lesson today? 40. He's 40 years old. Let's keep reading a little bit more, Norm.
The patriot feared the effect of the corrupting influences surrounding his son. In the mind of Abraham, the choice of a wife for his son was a matter of grave importance.
How important?
Grave.
Grave importance. The second most important decision we make in our lives, is it not? What's the first one?
Decision.
Whether we serve God or not, right? The second one is, who are we going to walk through this life with? George, you're waiting to say something, sir.
Abraham is already 140 years old.
Even older.
And the Bible say he become older, yeah. But anyway, a marriage is suggested in this age, 144.
Yep.
He wants to, how to say, do everything which possible to how to say?
Repopulate?
Repopulate, yeah. But look at that. If you read that story, after that, all son of Keturah has been separated from Isaac.
It is kind of a strange.
This is totally a different lesson for us. Even in Abraham, before he died, he just makes separation for that blessing which God gives him
for Isaac.
Through Isaac.
That's true. I wasn't actually thinking of going there. I was thinking of going somewhere else, but it is a good point. Finish that one up for us, Norm, and then we need to wrap up. We're at time.
He was anxious to have him marry one who would not lead him from God. Isaac, trusting to his father's wisdom and affection, was satisfied to commit the matter to him, believing also that God himself would direct in the choice made.
So notice the difference in the family relationships versus today, especially in countries like this country. Other countries, maybe there's still marriages in which the parents have a large influence in who is selected for their children. But you think of in the Western culture, the culture we've been through, who do you think chose my wife? I chose my wife. And how old was I? How old are most of us? 18, 20 years old. Now, some people are very young and they're still married. There's a couple examples sitting here in the front that have been married for many years. So it can work out. But there's an awful lot of trust, is there not, here? Isaac is a 40-year-old man. He's not an 18-year-old. He's gone through a lot of life. Yet who is he relying on to make an important choice like this for him?
He relied on his father.
Yes, there's an awful lot of trust, isn't there? So maybe there's some opportunities in our Western culture for things that we can still learn from other cultures, either in the past or in the rest of the place around the world. I'm not advocating we all go out and pick wives for our 12-year-old children. Miss Shirley's raising her hand. Passing Mike back, Norm. But I am saying that says something, as Nick said earlier, about the trusting family relationship where there is that knowledge and understanding that father knows God, son knows God, father and son making a big important decision like this, trust God to make the right choice. Miss Shirley.
But I think we do have influence over who they marry, over, the example that we set and how close the family is together. And secondly, Alvin made Dylan sweat. He had him pacing in the kitchen.
Hopefully it'll work out just as well as it did for you folks and your children as it did for Abraham.
It's 5 years today for them.
Well done. That's probably well over the average for the North American marriage, isn't it? All right. On that somber note, hope we all be able to make some of the anniversaries. Grandma and Grandpa, how many years do you have? 56. George and Alice, how many years marriage? 62. This is an accomplishment, isn't it? Good decisions and a lot of dedication. Someone willing to have closing prayer for us? Oh, somebody has more. Mr. Nam. How many years? Less than 50? Doing well, though. Congratulations. I've got a few years to go. Someone willing to have prayer for us? Please. Yes, please.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for the Sabbath day. We thank you for your mercy, for loving us in spite of ourselves. We thank you for your word, that we may continue to draw lessons from it every day of our life. It may be history, but it is constantly repeated, and you're constantly revealing yourself to us in your living word. We pray that you be with each of us the rest of this Sabbath day, and be with us in our service. May we praise and worship you to glorify you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.